My name is James Walker, and I carry with me a story that few would believe to be true. As the first officer of the merchant ship, Northern Star, I have spent the last 3 years trying to understand that terrible expedition that completely changed my life and my perception of the world. Before that fateful day, I was just another experienced sailor, accustomed to the obstacles of the Mediterranean Sea. At 35 years old, with a solid and respectable career, I never imagined that my existence would be marked by an event so profoundly disturbing. Life at sea had always seemed predictable to me, with its established routines and familiar challenges. Sailing was my passion, my profession, my identity. I had been working aboard the Northern Star for nearly a decade, a merchant ship that transported cargo between different Mediterranean ports. I knew every inch of that vessel, every creak of its wooden planks, every peculiarity of its behavior under different weather conditions. Captain Roberts was a man I deeply respected, a veteran with 30 years of maritime experience, who saw me as more than just a subordinate. We were almost like brothers, bound by the same passion for the sea. At that time in my life, I believed I knew all the secrets of the ocean. I had braved storms, faced nights of absolute darkness, and navigated routes considered challenging by many other sailors. My arrogance led me to believe that there was no mystery I could not unravel, no challenge I could not overcome. Life aboard the Northern Star was meticulous and well organized. Every crew member had their assigned duties, and we carried out our work with great precision. We were a cohesive team, bound not only by our work, but by a camaraderie that only develops when sharing such confined spaces for long periods. I never imagined that this apparent normalcy would be so brutally interrupted that October afternoon. Even 3 years later, I can still feel the shiver running down my spine when I recall those moments. The transformation of an ordinary, peaceful day into a nightmare of unimaginable proportions happened within minutes. My life before that day had been a sequence of voyages, ports, transported cargo, and stories shared during our nights off in the various places we visited. We were a floating family, bound by ties stronger than many could understand. Each of us had our own story, our own dreams, our own hopes. The crew of the Northern Star was made up of men from different nationalities and backgrounds. We had Portuguese, Greeks, Italians, and Spaniards. Some, like me, had decades of maritime experience. Others were young men in search of adventure and a different life. Miguel, our youngest officer, had barely turned 25 when it all happened. John, the carpenter, was an Irish veteran who seemed to know every secret of the trade. I could never have imagined that this voyage would be our last, that the faces I saw every day, with whom I shared meals, conversations, and moments of hard work, would soon become nothing more than traumatic memories of a massacre that defied all human comprehension. The normalcy of my previous existence vanished in that moment. 3 years later, I still wake up startled. I still hear the screams. I still see the horror in my crewmates' eyes. A single experience was enough to destroy an entire life built with dedication and hard work, turning me into a man obsessed with understanding the unexplainable. The storm caught us by surprise, transforming the once crystal blue sea into a black, turbulent mass within seconds. Towering waves rose like mountains, threatening to engulf our ship completely with every assault. Captain Roberts, with his 3 decades of seafaring experience, had never witnessed anything so violent and unpredictable. The winds howled with incredible force, lashing against our faces and making every wooden beam of the Northern Star groan and creak as if it were about to break apart. Sailors ran frantically from one side to the other, battling the elements, struggling to keep the ship even remotely stable, while the storm bombarded us with terrifying fury. It was during this desperate fight against nature that we saw something. A landmass emerging from the mist like a ghostly apparition. It wasn't a mirage or a trick played by our exhausted senses. It was solid ground, rising from the raging waters as if conjured by some supernatural force. I immediately consulted every nautical chart we had on board. I scoured every map, every record, every document that could provide us with any information about the region. To my utter astonishment, the island simply did not exist anywhere. No records, no markings, no references. It was as if that piece of land had just emerged from the depths of the ocean, or, more disturbingly, as if it had always been there, invisible to all. waiting for the right moment to be discovered. Our situation was critical. Our freshwater supplies were dangerously low, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. At that point, any safe harbor would have been a blessing, even if it was an entirely unknown island. Captain Roberts assembled a team of 10 men, including myself, for a reconnaissance mission to search for essential resources. The instructions were clear and direct: find drinkable water and return before nightfall. At that moment, we had no idea of the horror that awaited us. The island seemed like our only hope for survival, our refuge from the relentless fury of the sea. As we approached, the island revealed unique and unsettling features. Its geological formation was unmistakably volcanic, with jagged black rocks rising from dense, seemingly untouched vegetation. The air around us carried a peculiar scent, a mix of salt and something else, something we couldn't quite identify but that instinctively put us on edge. When we finally anchored in a small, sheltered bay, the silence was eerie. The storm seemed to have vanished entirely, as if this piece of land was a portal to an entirely different reality. No sound of birds, no buzzing of insects, no movement beyond our own. At that moment, we had no way of knowing that we were about to step into a nightmare that would change our lives forever. The island was not just a refuge, it was a deadly trap waiting for us. The island was a labyrinth of dense vegetation and volcanic rocks, rising like natural barriers, challenging our progress. Every step was a battle against tangled vines, thick undergrowth, and uneven terrain that seemed determined to keep us from advancing. Our trek was slow and exhausting. We carried essential equipment: canteens, lanterns, machetes to clear the path, and basic provisions for what we expected to be a brief exploration. Captain Roberts had been adamant: find water and return before nightfall. After 2 grueling hours of walking, we began to hear a sound that filled us with hope: running water. The noise was soft, echoing between the rocks and vegetation. Our thirst, already tormenting us, seemed to grow even more urgent at the promise of relief. It was Miguel who first noticed something strange in the surroundings. His expression, once focused on our progress, shifted to a mix of curiosity and apprehension. "Gentlemen, look at this," he called out, pointing to markings on the nearby rock walls. These marks were not natural formations. They were clearly paintings, ancient symbols carved or drawn onto the stone. The images depicted a disturbing narrative: a monstrous figure and humanoid figures fleeing in absolute terror. The strokes were primitive, yet incredibly expressive, as if those who created them had desperately wanted to capture a moment of pure fear. At that moment, something inside me warned of a danger we had yet to fully understand. The paintings didn't seem to be mere historical records. They were warnings. Warnings we were about to ignore completely. Little did we know that these images were only the first sign that our reconnaissance mission was about to turn into the most horrifying nightmare we could have imagined. The cave ahead, with its inviting sound of flowing water, beckoned us like a siren, without revealing the horrors that lurked within its rocky depths. The cave opened before us like a rocky throat, damp and dark. The stone walls were covered in greenish moss, and the sound of running water echoed hypnotically, growing louder as we ventured deeper inside. Our lanterns cast flickering shadows, creating eerie patterns of light that made the atmosphere even more menacing. Our steps were cautious, each movement carefully measured to avoid making too much noise. The tunnel sloped gently downward, leading us into the island's depths, revealing ancient, damp rock formations filled with bats. The air carried a heavy mix of moisture, stone, and something else, an organic scent we couldn't quite identify. Then, to our surprise, we found it. A crystal-clear spring bubbled from the rocks, forming a small underground pool of seemingly pure and inviting water. But we were not the only occupants of this space. Scattered across the ground were bones, hundreds of them, some fresh, with remnants of flesh still clinging to them, others old and bleached by time. Among them, we recognized human remains, skulls, ribs, femurs, indistinguishably mixed with the bones of animals we couldn't identify. Horror crept over us in silence. This part of the cave wasn't just a source of fresh water, it was a slaughterhouse. A place where something or someone had turned living beings into discarded remnants. The bones seemed to tell a story of carnage that our rational minds struggled to comprehend. And then, we heard it. A roar so deep it made the very ground tremble. A sound that defied any known animal classification. Something was about to find us. The creature emerged from the deepest shadows of the cave like a nightmare made flesh. Larger than 3 men, its silhouette defied all anatomical logic. Its skin was like aged leather, wrinkled and thick, a grayish hue that seemed to absorb the very light from our lanterns. In the center of its deformed face, a single eye glowed with a malignant, ancient hunger. A gaze that was not merely predatory, but carried an ancient intelligence, an understanding beyond what our human minds could process. It was a gaze that didn't view us as living beings, but as prey. Its body structure was monstrous. Muscles upon muscles intertwined beneath that aged skin, creating an anatomy that mixed human features with something entirely alien. Its hands, disproportionately large, ended in long fingers with filthy claws that seemed capable of tearing through metal. The smell emanating from this bizarre thing was nauseating, a mix of rot, dried blood, and something that resembled decayed sea air. It was the stench of something that had inhabited the island's depths for millennia, feeding on everything in its path. When it moved, its speed surprised us. Despite its massive size, the cyclopean creature moved with an agility that defied all laws of physics. Every movement was calculated. Every step carried a predatory intent that paralyzed us instantly. We were merely prey, waiting to be hunted. Panic was instantaneous. John, our carpenter, was the first to fall. The creature grabbed him as if he were a rag doll, lifting him above its head with incomprehensible strength. With a bizarre laugh that echoed through the rock walls, it clenched its fingers around his body. John's bones snapped like dry twigs, his scream cutting off in a choked gargle before he was thrown against the cave wall, where his body disintegrated into a grotesque red pool. Marcus tried to use his pistol, unloading all his bullets into the creature. The bullets pierced its thick skin, but it only roared, irritated, as if stung by insects. With a movement too fast for its size, the Cyclops grabbed Marcus by the ankle and dragged him across the floor, his body scraping against the sharp rocks. Then it lifted him and bit into him. The sound of teeth crushing bone and flesh was the worst thing I've ever heard. Marcus's scream echoed horribly before turning into a wet gurgle. We ran like rats in a maze, driven by pure survival instinct. The creature pursued us, its bizarre laugh echoing through the cave walls. Tom stumbled. I tried to help him, but that thing was already on him. It grabbed his head with both hands and, in a cruel motion, twisted his neck at an impossible angle. The dry snap of the bone breaking echoed before Tom's limp body was thrown aside. 2 more of us fell, trying to distract the monster so others could escape. Miguel attempted to flee through one of the side tunnels, but the Cyclops, with an unimaginable leap for its size, reached him and slammed him to the ground with a strike of its massive fist. Miguel screamed for a second before his chest caved under the brutal force. The carnage was complete. Every second felt like an eternity of horror. Every movement of the creature was a death sentence. We were no longer humans. We were prey being hunted by a predator that viewed our existence as mere entertainment. Of the 10 who entered the cave, only 5 of us made it back to the ship. We were bloodied, traumatized, but alive. Our bodies carried the physical and mental scars of that massacre, and our eyes were completely empty, unable to process the horror we had witnessed. Captain Roberts could hardly believe our story when we returned. His face, usually stern and controlled, was pale and shocked. Seeing our faces, he understood that something truly terrible had happened, something beyond human comprehension. We set sail immediately, leaving that cursed place behind. Each of us was submerged in a deafening silence, the screams of our fallen comrades still echoing in our minds. We didn't need to exchange words. Our looks were enough to communicate the shared trauma. As we moved away, I swear I saw the creature atop a cliff, its bizarre single eye staring into the twilight, as if warning us that this would not be our last encounter. At that moment, I understood that our lives would never be the same again. We had survived something that no human being should ever have to face. Since then, I have dedicated my life to researching and understanding that terrifying encounter. I've delved into ancient Greek stories about ghost islands in the Mediterranean, scoured reports of ships disappearing in seemingly calm waters, and studied legends of monsters the ancients called cyclopes. I always believed such stories were just myths, created to scare inexperienced sailors. Now I know the truth. In the depths of our modern and civilized world, there are still horrors beyond human comprehension. Creatures from the legends, waiting in the dark, hungry for human flesh. My obsession led me to investigate historical records, ancient documents, and accounts from sailors. I discovered disturbing patterns, unexplained disappearances, fragmented stories of encounters similar to ours, subtle clues of a reality most prefer to ignore. 3 years after that day, I began receiving anonymous envelopes, old photographs of missing ships, fragments of diaries from 19th century sailors, maps marked with strange locations. All the evidence pointed to a terrifying conclusion. Our island was not an isolated case. I write this account as a final warning. If, one day during a storm in the Mediterranean, you spot an island that's not on any map, don't be fooled by the promise of refuge. For there are places in this world that should remain unexplored, and some legends exist for a reason. As for me, I can never look at the sea the same way again. At night, when I close my eyes, I can still see that bizarre single eye staring at me from the shadows, and I wonder, how many other ancient secrets still sleep in the depths of our oceans, waiting to be discovered? It may sound like madness. Sometimes when I walk along the beach in the late afternoon, I smell a strange and familiar scent of salt water. Someone, or something, is here.